for my second semester history project, I created a, obviously fictitious, time machine. And I had my students going back in history, in this case because it was Jewish history, to specific times and places which were relevant to Jewish history. For example, Spain in 1492, when the Spanish Jewish community was expelled. Well, you have the Inquisition, which was ongoing, but the expulsion took place in 1492. And so they'd have to go, quote, to a place. They'd have to prepare all of the relevant information about that place. What was the language and the weather and the currency and the form of dress and all these kinds of general pieces of information. And then they would have to find out Jewish specific information, the leading rabbis and where the communities were and all this kind of stuff. And then they had to turn it into a website, and the website was a playoff of Travelocity.com. I called it TravelHistory.com. And they would have to create an online itinerary for, you're going to come, you're going to land at such and such a place, and you're going to travel by such and such a form. Day one will do this, and day two will do that, and all these kinds of things. And they had to integrate certain amounts of information. So again, it was trying to create an authentic expression of what otherwise could be just abstract historical information. And I knew I was successful. I'm not going to tell you this because I want to pat myself on the back, but I'm telling you this because I want to encourage you to consider it. We had in our school a student exchange program. It was one directional. We shipped kids to Israel. The Israelis did not ship any kids to Chicago. But it was a sophomore program, last quarter of the year. Typically, the girls went in larger number. My year happened to be a number of boys went also. And they came back at the end in June. And they said to me, I asked them how it was, and they were so excited and this and that. That year, I had introduced my students to a variety of what's called Webquest. This was Web 1.0. Bernie Dodge was big in the time. A Webquest was an online unit, and you would be dealing with an issue, whatever the issue might be. And you'd have resources that you already put into the website with a particular set of expectations and roles and these kinds of things. And so I wanted them to study a particular builder by the name of Herod, who was also a king, a ruler. But with a particular focus on his buildings, not so much a focus on his leadership and his tyranny and all sorts of awful things that he did as a person. He happened to be a great builder, one of those sort of split personality types, great builder, awful person, awful person. The other communities may have called him Herod the Great, but that certainly wasn't how he was known within the Jewish community. Anyway, so there was an architect and there was a tour guide, and they had different responsibilities, each one of these jobs. And they had to talk about their particular edifice or structure. For example, Herod's Palace in Jerusalem, or Masada, as I mentioned before, or Caesarea up in the north. There was an aqueduct that he built, all sorts of different things. And each one took one of them. And each one had a role within that one. And so they tell me that when they come back from Israel, that the tour guide who had taken them around the country had told them that he had never met a group of American kids who had known more about the land of Israel than this group, which I took as a big compliment. But more importantly, it was evidence to me that the type of learning we were doing was making an impact, because they were owning it. Otherwise, they were just sort of getting it, and it's in one ear and out the other. And that's something we always want to be sensitive to. Any thoughts here before we get into authentic assessment in more detail? Okay, so it's about creating tasks, ideally ones that replicate real-life scenarios. We're looking, by the way, at number 16. It's less about acquiring information, it's more about creating. It's more about doing something with the information. Okay, so you're looking at the third bullet. Okay, on the left side. That makes sense? You got it? Do you have a comment or question? Okay. And the basic concept again is that since information now is all available on our devices, while you still want them to have basic information, that's not where we want to put our primary emphasis. So again, instead of just saying to the students, we're going to learn about the four candidates, leading candidates of the presidential race, and then I'm going to give you a test. We're going to learn about the four primary candidates, and I'm going to ask you to participate in a debate, for example. And in participating in a debate, I own it more. I kept it open before because I thought it was a little stifling. It's like, you can't win. You
Maybe
can't
they're
win.
freezing us a fry.
That's right, exactly. So that's why I kept the door open, to get a little bit of airflow in here. Okay, may I move to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay. Now here's some other, this by the way is not Alcoholics Anonymous, but authentic assessment. By the way, I think I already mentioned they're also referred to as alternative assessment because there are other ways by which to test than the conventional form. So qualities is that they're often built around topics of interest to the students. We talked about how they replicate real-world contexts or situations. And they show that students are actually able to perform a real-life function, a real-life task. This is, I think that's the slide over here was extra. This is the one I wanted you to see. My apologies. Okay? Now, the key thing here is that you're able to quantify what you want your students to be able to do. And I'm going to give you a sheet that I created for myself that you might find useful as well. And we'll look at it together in just a second.
What is
Quantify means to put it in numbers. So it's not just touchy-feely, but you actually need it to. It actually is something you can measure. Measuring is very important. So for example, if you're going to debate on an issue with the 4 candidates, how do I measure that you debated properly? Does that make sense? How do I know you did a good job? The answer is I'm going to use a rubric or something to help me measure. So when you're done, these last 2 points, before I get to the sheet, this one talks about that it creates more involvement between the teacher and the student, which is nice. Typically speaking, a test doesn't promote that in the same way. And then also allows the students to self-assess. Right? If I have a rubric, I know exactly what the teacher wants from me. I can sort of gauge my work before I even hand it in. And then I can make corrections as appropriate. The more I know as a learner, the better job I'm going to do as a learner. I'm right now, thank God, finally in the finishing pieces, I shouldn't say that yet because there's still a ways to go, of a doctorate. And I mention that because I've been doing this all online, and some professors will just give you readings and they'll say, okay, say something specific about the reading, whatever it might be, and some of them are asking you particular questions that they want you to answer. So I find, and I'm an adult and I'm an educator and whatever else I might have to boast about, I still find that the readings are much easier to approach when I have certain questions that I know I need to answer, rather than when I have an open-ended question of what was meaningful to you about this, or one of those kinds of things, where you got to read everything and you're not really sure what's important here. So a rubric really helps you laser in focus on what it is. Did you get this sheet? Do you have this?
Yeah, it's right here.
So we're actually looking at this one right now. So when you talk about authentic assessment, I'd love to spend more time on this, and I'm sorry if it feels like we're going a little too quickly here. But what you want to do is you want to identify what are your standards that your students should be able to do, to know, right? Because remember, with every process, there has to be some type of assessment on the back end. So what are the standards you want your students to be able to achieve? I would use Bloom's or something similar to help you, or your curriculum to help you guide that process. Then, once you know what you want them to be able to do, think of an appropriate task that's going to help you get there. So you've now completed the first line about the standards, then you've identified a task that could be useful to you in terms of determining what it is exactly that indicates that the students have met the standards. From there, I would create a rubric. Are you familiar with rubrics? Okay, so you're familiar with the idea that you need a list of criteria and gradients of quality. These are the things they should be able to do. This is what excellent looks like. This is what very good looks like. Good and could have done better there, Johnny. Right? Not so good. That type of thing. Typically, by the way, they say that you should fill in 4 and 1 first. Whatever your outliers are, do those first. What's really good and what's kind of like acceptable, but just barely. All right? And then you fill in the middle ones. They also say sometimes you should do it yes, no, and then yes, but, and no, but, which would mean, writes clear sentences that have an obvious beginning and end. Yes, that meets the standard completely. Yes, but means he does it, but could be a little bit better, whatever particular way. No means he didn't do it at all. No but means he didn't do it, but he did at least something that'll earn him a point, or 2 points, right? That type of idea. That's how you create a rubric. So you start with the process of, well, what do I want them to be able to do? What's the skill, content or skill that I want them to show that they've mastered? What task could I give them that will help them show that they've learned it? So in my case, I wanted them to learn all about a Jewish community. Spain 1492, Jerusalem 70 CE, Troyes, France in the year 1096 around the time of Rashi, whatever it might be. I wanted them to learn 20 different criteria's worth of information about a period of time. What task will I give them to demonstrate that they've learned it? I'm going to ask them to write a website with a travel itinerary and all of this. What will excellence look like? I create a rubric that supports that and gives them exact clarity about how a good product will ultimately look. And then finally, number 4, well actually 3 and 4 then become the creation of the rubric. So whatever you ask your students to do, if it's low-key, if it's sort of just like an ad hoc type of thing you're doing in class, a rubric may not be necessary. But if it's something that's got some points attached to it, and you really want to be able to ensure that A, you're objective, but more important even than being objective, you're clear in what you want, so that the students can be clear in what to give you, then a rubric can be extremely helpful in that process. And the more that you make it real-life oriented, the likelier it is that they'll be invested in it, because they'll care about it, because they see it as being relevant to them. So let's take a look at some applications. Now you should find that we have turned to number 18. I did not include, I think I must have taken out 17 or at least put it later in the PowerPoint. So let's jump to 18 for now. By the way, I did organize these by modality, which I thought might be useful. Okay, so you have over here, how am I going to give them different types of projects that are verbal in orientation. A diary is a good example. We talked about that before. Having them write poetry. Letting them write a newspaper article. The logical mathematical, we've talked about a travel itinerary and a timeline. The video talked about planning an event. Again, these are all things that you're asking your students either to make or to complete as ways of giving you feedback. If there's anything here you have a question about, please don't hesitate to ask. While you're writing, I'm going to give you one final item, which I think in many ways is a nice summary of, sorry, I needed to bang into the table at least one more time before we finish today. I just found that this list that I just gave you is sort of like a nice summary of a lot of the things that we talked about. Here you have now graphic organizers. Just for a moment there. Does anyone still need the previous slide?
Yeah.
Because I'm going to leave it there. Those of you who are done, kindly take a look at the graphic organizer packet that I gave you at the beginning where we looked at the KWL. I'd like to briefly review the rest of them with you just so that you're familiar. Those of you who teach younger grades, please forgive me, these are the more mature version. There are ones with ice cream cones and some school buses and all sorts of fun things. So if you go to that website or many others, you will find some graphic organizers that may be helpful. And parenthetically, this last one in your packet is really for you, sort of as like a guide to make sure you don't forget about different types of learning styles. Right? In any one unit that I teach, can I make sure that I have opportunities for the verbal learner, for the logical learner, for the visual learner? Am I giving them opportunities to engage? Right, what do I have available to them? That was the last one that is in your packet. So I'm going to go now follow in the order in which it was prepared for us. The KWL we've looked at. And hopefully before we're done today, we can fill in this box a little bit. Okay? The KWS. Does anyone want to comment on how it differs from the KWL? It's the second one. Go right ahead, please.
It focuses on where, like how to find the knowledge, like where can I look myself
Good.
for the knowledge?
So where would you see yourself using a KWS particularly? More research paper, yeah, something where you gotta go digging a little bit. Of course, the answer today would just be Google. But back in the den, when they used to have something called a library, you might actually have to go there, that kind of thing. The Venn we've discussed, comparing periods, comparing countries, comparing who knows what. This one I happen to like a lot, especially for the visual learners. Take an idea, but instead of just putting it in words on a board, you branch it out. We talked about Civil War. What's the main cause of the main cause of Civil War goes in the middle. One cause, two causes, this kind of thing. And then you branch out further by subsection. Or the four leading candidates, Trump, Cruz, you list them here, and a couple of key pieces of information about each. Or anything you want to teach. It could be about holidays. It could be about weather and seasons, right? You put spring, summer, fall, winter, and a couple of key aspects about each of them. Of course, if you want to get into any level of detail, this has to branch out a little bit further. This is good for any sequencing, logical, scientific processes, literature with a storyline that unfolds over time. What are the key steps? And then the last one, at least that you might use in your classroom, would be your timeline. And the timeline could be good for a scientific project, it could be good certainly for history. You what?
I don't have it.
The packet? We have more over here, I'll be happy to give you this one. And this way you'll have the entire thing.
So if I was doing like the Megillah of Esther,
Yes.
read the story,
Go ahead.
they have to sequence
Yeah,
whatever
yeah,
first, whatever.
right. Sequence it based off of actual gaps, historical gaps, let's call it. This took place and then 5 years later this, and then 2 months later this. So you might have a cluster over here, it's sort of a big gap over there. That's usually how it would be utilized. So people can sort of see how it plots. The other applications, oral, we've talked about, role play, talk show, debate, I know I've mentioned all of those. Artistic could be extremely powerful. If you have artists in your class, or at least, not their day job, but even so, you may want to give them opportunity to illustrate things. You may have a future graphic organizer in your class, or an interior designer, right? The interior designers of the world, when they're in school, they have a tough time because it doesn't speak to them the same way. But if you give them opportunity to use that natural gift that they have and express topics by location and by layout and by all sorts of things like that, now you're talking. Someone mentioned before the colonial period. That was you, right? So now an interior designer may take a look and say, well, what does the interior of a colonial house look like? And where would the food be prepared? And where would the wood be chopped? And where would the who knows what? All kinds of things like that. You're giving them a chance to sort of visualize it in that type of way. Okay? A retelling would just be an opportunity for students to convey information to others as if the other person never heard it before, and then that person would check to make sure that all of the key information was told to them by their peers. So it's sort of like a peer review process. You can't do a retelling with all 20 of your kids, but you could have your kids talking to each other, and they can kind of test one another. Which is that you got to start slow with whatever you do. It's got to feel right. It's got to fit to make sure that we are successful. I encourage you strongly to adopt a steady approach. Set goals. If you could have a peer that you refer to, where each of you say, I'm going to adapt certain things in my class, and you hold yourself accountable to it so that you are adding slowly but consistently to your toolkit, and then over time you are finding that many of the things you already have been doing do fit within differentiation, and now you've found ways by which to augment and add and recap. And start with the low prep stuff. If you start with the high prep stuff, you may never get beyond that first hurdle. So to recap, what do we mean by differentiating the product?
Authentic assessment.
Yes.
How to differentiate.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay.
I'm going to be sending you a survey.
Different types of products, different things we could do to ensure. We talked about a bunch of them, different types of modalities, everything from a role play to a debate. Thank you, all the best. Okay, how can they be assessed? The main thing I would say is to use a rubric where you can. Because the more that you do, the clearer it'll be for them and the clearer it'll be for you. And then, somebody who mentioned parents earlier on, they will also be kept at bay because you have an objective way by which to say your child did or did not perform. And that can be ultimately